This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg. Our podcast and YouTube channel, Spirit Matters Talk, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Also, if you go to YouTube, you just type in Spirit Matters Talk, and we are now available there. And our archives are free and available to the public with over 300 interviews. We have back on our show today, I'm very happy to have back on our show, Matthew Fox. He is an American priest and theologian, formerly a member of the Dominican order with the Catholic Church. He became a member of the Episcopal Church following his expulsion from the order in 1993. Matthew has written 35 books that have been translated into 68 languages and have sold millions of copies worldwide. His latest book, which we'll be discussing today, Matthew Fox, Essential Writings on Creation Spirituality. Matthew, thank you so very much for taking the time to come back on the show with us.
Thank you, Dennis and Philip. I've always enjoyed your show, and I love what you're doing with it. Spirit does matter, I think.
Thank you.
Great,
yeah. For listeners, we interviewed Matthew a couple of years ago, so we commend you to go back to our archive and tune into that, and you'll hear more about Matthew's background and his unique and important journey. I want to focus today on this new book, which is essentially a collection of excerpts from the voluminous writings of Matthew Fox, compiled by Charles Burak. Matthew, what led to this book? Why this book now?
Well, it was an invitation from Orbis Books because they have a series here that they call Modern Spiritual Masters. And they've done books like this for Thich Nhat Hanh, for Thomas Merton, Richard Rohr, Flannery O'Connor, and it's good company.
Great company.
Flannery O'Connor, interesting.
Wow.
Yeah. In fact, that was one of their first in the series. It is interesting. But also I think it's timely because, for one thing, I'm now 81 years old, and it's a way to kind of summarize for a new generation, especially, what creation spirituality means, because that's what got me in all the trouble that I got in. You alluded to that in your invitation or your opening remarks here, Dennis, that yeah, my journey's been a little bumpy. And what should I say? It disturbed the powers that be in the Vatican 30 years ago or so. And but I love what Joe Campbell says, that none of us lives a life we had intended. So when I joined the Dominicans, I thought that was kind of the rest of my life. But as it turned out, things were a lot more exciting than I had anticipated.
Maybe you can, for those people who've not heard the term creation spirituality, please define it for us and explain why it got you in trouble.
Yes. It was my mentor when I did my doctoral studies in spirituality at the Institut Catholique in Paris. My mentor there was Father Chanou, Père Chanou, a 75-year-old at the time, Dominican theologian, who was very important in the Second Vatican Council, and very important with the foundational liberation theology in South America. And he was silenced by the Pope for 12 years in 1940s and 1950s. Because he was working with Marxists after the war, and also because he was trying to reinvent education, which has been a big part of my world too. But the Second Vatican Council kind of brought him out of the dark, and he played an important and very positive role there. But anyway, he's the one who named the creation spiritual tradition for me. And I remember the moment in class, it was like St. Paul falling off his horse. It just made so much sense to me that there are two traditions, two rivers in the Christian tradition. One is fall redemption. It begins with sin, and it kind of goes downhill with there. Whereas creation begins with creation, the goodness of creation. Check it out. Genesis 1, the first page of the Bible. I swear 98% of Christian preachers have had the first page of their Bible ripped out by somebody, because there's not a word about sin or evil. It's about how good the world is. This is good. The sun is good. The plants are good. The trees are good. The animals are good. And then humans come along and it's very good. I mean, hey, where did that optimism go, you know? So that's really, and so I talk about original blessing, and that was the book that blew the roof off the Vatican, because I learned from their response, their exaggerated response, that they're really invested in original sin, even though Jesus never heard about original sin. No Jews heard about original sin. Elie Wiesel says the idea of original sin is alien. It's not only not in the Bible, he says it's alien to Jewish thinking. So what is this? That Christians have followed St. Augustine. That's the first time the term is used, is in the 4th century. And it was a century that Christianity inherited the Roman Empire. So there's some kind of not so subtle connection there. If you're going to run an empire, original sin is great. But if you can talk about Jesus' teachings, original blessing is what he was talking about. And the great mystics, I've been working on Hildegard of Bingen, Thomas Aquinas, of course, Francis of Assisi is in that tradition, Meister Eckhart, Julian Norwich, and so forth. They talk this way too, and about bringing in the feminine, the motherhood of God. Julian of Norwich, who's over my shoulder here, that's the cover of my recent book on her. She talks about God as mother and develops it in a very rich and profound way. So I was accused of this heresy of being a feminist theologian. That's what Cardinal Ratzinger said. I didn't know being a feminist theologian was a heresy, but he thinks so. This is projection. And of course, original blessing, they did not like that. And I don't condemn homosexuals. And that was a list of complaints, that and a few more from them. But anyway, it was a journey.
I'm curious.
Yeah.
You started thinking along these lines once you started studying in Paris. And I read that the person that encouraged you to go to Paris to study was Thomas Merton. And I'm wondering, what was the reason he encouraged you to go to Paris to study? And do you think back in his mind, he was thinking along your lines and maybe had that influence on you early on?
Yes, I wrote him when my Dominican superior said you can go to Europe to get a doctorate in spirituality, which I was pushing someone to do, because we weren't really studying spirituality in the seminary, which is pretty typical. They said, well, where to go? And I said, well, let me write Thomas Merton. They thought I was crazy. But 4 days later, I got a full page letter from Merton saying, go to Paris, go to the Institut Catholique in Paris. So it took a while. They said to me, no, you can't go to Paris. I said, why not? Well, they said, we never sent anyone to France who came home again. So, but we had a standoff for 2 or 3 months. I kept hitting them over the head with Merton's letter. And finally, they relented and sent me to Paris. And of course, later, I think they regretted I came home. But anyway, that's another story. But yeah, Merton was, I read him when I was a teenager, like a lot of people did. And I was very moved by his description of his journey. And of course, I read him in my more mature years, but he was especially influenced by Meister Eckhart. In 1958, Merton was interacting with D.T. Suzuki, who brought Zen from Japan to America. And Suzuki loved Eckhart. And he said to Merton, you must read the one Zen thinker of the West, Meister Eckhart. And Merton said, but he's been condemned by the church. And Suzuki said, well, I can't help that, can I? So Merton thought about it. He spent the year 1958 reading nothing but Zen poetry and Eckhart. And it flipped him. He's a totally different person after 1958. He becomes prophetic, and he speaks out about war, about the Vietnam War. He links up with Dr. King, with Thich Nhat Hanh, who of course is very young then, with the Dalai Lama. And his life just shifted, but it was Eckhart. And Merton wrote in his last Asian journal to Asia, where he died, he wrote in the journal, Eckhart is my lifeboat. Eckhart is my lifeboat.
Wow.
So Eckhart was very important to Merton, and he was very important to me as I got into my.
Well, now that you mentioned Eckhart, Meister Eckhart. I can tell you, when I first was exposed to Meister Eckhart, absolutely blew my mind.
Ooh.
I had no idea there were people like that in the Western tradition.
Huh.
And so for those in listening and watching who are not familiar with Eckhart, tell us a little bit about him and why he is such a luminary among the Christian mystics.
Yeah. Well, he was a Dominican, like Thomas Aquinas was, and like I was. And he was born when Aquinas was about, let me think. He was 15 when Aquinas died. And by the way, Rumi, I think if I have it right, that he was about 13 when Rumi died. So it was a very interesting era in human consciousness. And he was a contemporary of Hafiz, the wonderful Sufi mystic who followed on Rumi. And but he's no doubt one of the greatest mystics of the West, if not the greatest. But he was condemned a week after he died by the Pope. But like many condemnations, it was very political. He was in support of the women's movement of the day, the Beguines. He lived in the late 13th, early 14th century. And the Pope at the time, John the 22nd, condemned the Beguines 17 times, which suggests that it wasn't real effective, his condemnation. And by the time that Pope died, there were hundreds of thousands of Beguines. And the Beguines were women who chose not to be married and not to be nuns. At that time, to be a nun meant you were locked in a cloister. So they were in the world, earning and living with their hands, sewing and making stained glass and so forth, and working with the poor and the young and the sick. That was their main work. And the Pope actually said, anyone who works with them, any priest who works with them will be expelled from the priesthood. Well, that didn't slow Eckhart down. He worked with them very closely. They took down a lot of his sermons. It's because of them that we have his writings, his preaching. And he also supported the peasants. In Germany in that time, there was a growing gap between the haves and have-nots. In fact, after Eckhart died, after he was condemned, 10 years later, the peasant wars broke out. And Eckhart was at his trial. He had this trial in Avignon where the Pope was living. And they said to him, why do you preach to these peasant people in their own language? If you preached in Latin, we'd let you go, because you're telling them disturbing things like they're aristocrats and they're noble. And, you know, the aristocrats don't want to hear that. They didn't tell them that, but the aristocrats didn't want to hear that the peasants were being told that they're noble. So Eckhart was trying to build up the self-worth of the peasant people. And for that, he was condemned, that and supporting the Beguines, the women's movement. So he was prophetic as well as mystical. And you know, my latest book at Eckhart, I put him in the room with Thich Nhat Hanh in one chapter. So he's been called Buddhist by Buddhists.
Right.
He's been called Hindu by Kumaraswamy, the great Hindu. He's been called Jung. Well, Jung says, I got the key to the unconscious from Meister Eckhart.
Is that right?
Amazing.
Wow,
Yeah. So there's a chapter on Jung and Meister, and then Rabbi Heschel and Meister Eckhart. So, I mean, he's just amazing. I don't know anyone, living or dead, who's had such a broad influence and through so many traditions as Eckhart has had.
I think of him as the Advaita Vedantist of the West. He's the great non-dual.
Absolutely non-dual.
Well, I want to ask Matthew, today, when you were expelled from the Catholic Church, that was then. This is now new leadership and all. Would they be more receptive to you when you're thinking now? And also their view toward Eckhart, would it be different now than it would have been when you were expelled? Has the church evolved? Has it changed?
Sure.
Or is it the same old church?
Same old church. Everything evolves. That's the law of the universe, isn't
But is it
it?
evolving?
Even churches
in a better
evolve.
direction?
Sometimes they evolve to the darker end,
Yeah,
and sometimes
that's
to the
my
brighter.
question. Yeah.
But no, Pope Francis, even the choice of the name that he took is of another ilk from those previous two popes who gave me a bad time. And for example, his wonderful encyclical on the environment, Laudate Si, actually, it was written by a student of mine, a master student who was going through my creation spirituality master's program. He was a priest from Ireland who was living in the Philippines. And after graduating from our program, he went back to the Philippines and started writing some books on ecology and spirituality, which obviously Pope Francis heard about or read. And he plucked them up from the Philippines, took them to Rome and said, write this. So for me, that's quite a, what could I say, quite a jump from being censored and called a heretic by two popes. And in fact, they actually said, this is a quote, let's see, I memorized it. Dangerous and deviant. They said creation spirituality is dangerous and deviant. And of course, this is the same pope who's now in trouble for not dealing with pedophile priests. And but Pope Francis is Laudate Si, and I've done a major review of it, commentary on it, and it follows the four paths of creation spirituality, and it's very much within a common tradition. And one scientist who's worked with me over the years has said that that encyclical is the best encyclical on science that Vatican has ever written in history. So no, Pope Francis is of another ilk than those previous. But nevertheless, you know, he's up against a lot of opposition within the ecclesial structure hierarchy, because the previous two popes left behind a lot, I mean, a bunch of very right-wing and bishops and cardinals, Opus Dei and all that. So he's got his hands full. So I don't know what history will say about, well, what will unfold from all that. But I give Pope Francis credit. I criticize him for some things, like his canonizing Junipero Serra was a horrible thing here in California.
Right.
You work with Native people like I do. I mean, they actually said to me, if he goes ahead and canonizes that guy, he's making war on indigenous people the world over. That is a quote from a Native American leader in California. It was a horrible mistake. So, you know, I don't bury my head about that. But of course, we're all imperfect and we make mistakes. And popes like to say they're infallible, but hey, there are a lot of mistakes if you look at history. There's still a lot of encyclopedias, the mistakes made by popes, like the doctrine of discovery in the 15th century, which gave permission to Christian kings and queens to raid the New World and Africa for slaves, the New World for gold and silver, whatever. I mean, the destruction that followed after the 15th century doctrine of discovery bulls by two popes is horrible, and it needs apologizing. I think it'd be wonderful if Pope Francis were to burn those documents right in St. Peter's Square with the television cameras going, or at least a Xerox copy. They can put the originals under glass someplace in a museum, but you know, that would say a lot. I think the Native people would appreciate that.
Right. I'm just curious, were there members of the were there priests in the Catholic Church, like somebody, for instance, like Thomas Keating, that reached out and tried to give you support at the time you were going through your troubles with the church?
My trials. Well, I'll tell you, especially the Dutch Dominicans, they reached out strongly in their council, the group that runs things. They sent a formal letter to my provincial saying, we will adopt Matthew Fox. He can join our province, become a Dutch Dominican, and still keep his work going in California. And I went to my provincial and said, this is a win-win-win. You guys don't have to deal with Rome. And what the Dutch said to me, they said, you know, we've been fighting the Vatican for 750 years. We know how to defend theologians. The American Dominicans don't. They've never had to do it, really. But so we want to adopt you. And I thought, well, this is win-win-win. And but my provincial, who had the power to veto it, you have to permission from your previous province to switch to province. He slammed his fist on the table. He was 10 years younger than me in the order. And he said, I don't want you in any province in the world. So that was the end of that reaching out by the Dutch Dominicans. Yeah, there have been some priests over the years who have reached out to me, but not too many in America. I mean, the whole point of their silencing me for a year and was to put fear into theologians. And to be honest, I hate to say it, but it worked. I did not get a lot of support. But what can I say? I learned a lot about human nature in that process, that fear goes a long way.
And
It does, yeah.
after the fall came redemption.
Right.
Speaking of which, I'm intrigued in this beautiful collection of writings, and I should, for listeners, they're mostly short excerpts grouped together by theme from all of your writings, and where you explain creation spirituality, you the excerpt, as you did here, contrasts creation spirituality from the fall and redemption sort of theology. And you mentioned that earlier. But it seems to me that has tremendous implications. It's not just a theological formulation, but what follows from a creation spirituality as opposed to a fall and redemption about human life and how you live it and what we are and our nature. There's a lot there, which is probably why it was threatening. How did you see the implications and all these years of teaching and writing about creation spirituality? What do you see in the lives of people who move in that direction as opposed to the fall redemption direction?
Yeah, so one thing, of course, the obvious thing really is about climate change, isn't it? It's about our extinction that we're all facing, whether we're in denial about it or not. It's about the sacredness of creation and our responsibility to, to not destroy Mother Earth while we're here. And so it's about our empowerment to do something about it, and to stand up and say no, and to undergo those transformations of lifestyle, and of course to trigger our imaginations, our creativity, our science, to find ways out of this corner into which our species has painted ourselves. So it's that, and that is, I've been saying for years, the number 3 moral issues of our time are ecology, ecology, and ecology. I mean, if the air isn't clean and the food isn't, and the soil isn't there anymore, and the rivers aren't clean, I mean, none of us is going to lead lives that are blessed and joyful, and none of our children to come. So that's just really standing out now that we're in the 2020s, and so that stands out. But another dimension to it is that mysticism, the experience of the joy of life, but also the dark night of the soul and the emptying that we undergo, the contemplation, the mindfulness, but the mind emptiness too. All that is not an end in itself. It leads to creativity and to justice making and compassion and saying no. So the deepest responses of life, what prayer really is a yes to life and a no to injustice. And the first is what we call mysticism, and the second is what we call the prophetic vocation. So those two things work together as a dialectic, they dance. And I think that's what adult spirituality is about. And we admire it when we see it. Think of Thich Nhat Hanh, who passed just last month, that he was both of those things, wasn't he? He was a real, not just a contemplative, but a teacher of how to slow down and to be still. And in other words, to tame that reptilian brain that wants to, own the earth. And on the other hand, he also developed this new word in Buddhism, engaged Buddhism, which meant that you stood up to war makers. And he paid a price for it. He made enemies in North Vietnam and South Vietnam. He made enemies in his monastic community. He literally had to flee his country. And, so he paid the price that Jesus paid, that in many ways that Martin Luther King paid. He didn't pay the ultimate price of dying young and as a martyr. But anyway, such a great soul. And a part of creative spirituality too is deep ecumenism, to to find the wisdom in all the world traditions. I mean, I identify as a Christian, but I have more in common with, I hope, with the Thich Nhat Hanh than I do with the 700 Club, that version of Christian, which I find very difficult to
Matthew,
justify.
in your book, in your latest book, you write that it's something Phil and I have discussed, that 75% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 consider themselves spiritual but not religious. Is that in the big picture, even as a Christian theologian and clergy, is that a good sign? Is that something that can be used to bring Christianity to a more effective, a more original message than where we are at now?
Yeah. More authentic. Yes. Yes, I believe that. Christianity has existed for about 2,000 years, and there have been a lot of ups and a lot of downs, and we're in one of those down periods now. But I think one of the big things is the climate crisis, that the young people know that time is not on our side as a species and not on their side. Are they even going to want to bring children into the world? What is life going to be like in 30 years, etc.? So, you think of Greta Thunberg as one of these great prophets, but she's just one of many that are feeling those things that she articulates, and rightly so. And so they don't want to be bothered with all the piles of paraphernalia that we call religion at this time. As I say, we have to travel not with basilicas on our back, but backpacks. That spirituality today has to be troubadour-like. It has to be portable. And I include not just Western religion, but Eastern too. This is not a time for more monasteries. It's a time for what should I say, bringing together, synthesizing the best that the monastic traditions have to teach us, and to carry that into our work, whether you're a lawyer or a teacher or a politician or an artist or whatever, that lay people and have to become kind of take charge and be spiritual in their relationships, in their communities, in their families, and in their work. And I think this is the way to change the world, because time's running out. I mean, scientists say we have less than 8 years now that is 2022. So who are we kidding? And so I say we should travel with backpacks on our back, not basilicas.
Did Matthew,
and I think the young feel this. They may not articulate it, but that's where they're making the choices.
Absolutely.
The lengthy table of contents, and it's lengthy because it names every excerpt. So, and there are many, many short excerpts. Some of them stand out because they're very intriguing. And one is, one says, evil evolves. What do you mean by evil evolves? And I know that's related somehow to the concept of sin. So maybe you can explain both.
Well, I wrote a big book on evil called Sins of the Spirit, Blessings of the Flesh. And that's a phrase from Thomas Aquinas, actually, where he says that sins of the spirit are far more serious than sins of the flesh. Sins of the flesh, he said, takes you toward God, but sins of the spirit take you away from God. Well, when I came across that in Aquinas, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, it blew my mind because, so many preachers are real adept at talking about sins of the flesh, but how many Christians could actually name the sins of the spirit? And the sins of the spirit are things like greed and envy and violence and hatred and so forth. So, I mean, just that one sentence, which I boiled down to be the title of the book, the subtitle of the book is called Transforming Evil in Soul and Society. So I do think that at this time in history, especially we Americans, everybody is thinking about evil. And yet I think that the traditional church teaching on sin has been so oversold. I have met so many people, Protestant and Catholic, who told me at about the age of 14, they left the church, or at least they quit thinking about sin because they learned that everything was sin. Everything they liked was sin. So this isn't in my vocabulary anymore. So I think that there's been like the boy shouting wolf when it comes to sin. And the church has, I think, destroyed the meaning of evil by cheapening evil by talking about sin. So I really think there's a big difference between evil and sin. Evil is something much bigger. And we're experiencing it now. I mean, January 6th, that was televised evil. And the response to it, there's a whole chunk of Americans who say, oh, it was nothing. It was nothing. Yeah, we'll tell the policeman that, whose lives are ruined mentally. I mean, they're, the rest of their life. And of course, some lost their life. So the point is that evil is real close to us now. And we need more debate and discussion about evil, and we need to bring the word back. And I do disassociate it from sin, if you will. I mean, not entirely. You can't get away entirely from that language. But what I did in my book on evil was I went east, and I took the 7 chakras and compared it to the 7 capital sins the 7 sins of the spirit of the West. And it really works, because a chakra is a healthy power center. 7 of them traditionally in the physiology of our bodies, but also in our psychology and spirituality. And so sin, now the biblical word for sin, the Hebrew word for sin, is an archery term that means to miss the bullseye. So the chakra is a bullseye. And what is a chakra that's missing the bullseye? That would be, and it's comparable. I'll give you one example. The 7th chakra, of course, is here in the crown of our head. And what it is the gathering of our light and Kundalini energy all the way up our spine to that 7th chakra at the top of our head. And then it shoots out to join other light beings, ancestors, good people working in the world, saints, and the rest, and building community together. But an off-center chakra would be envy, because envy recognizes the light in others, but instead of joining up to do good work together, it wants to shoot it down. And envy is behind a lot of war and a lot of patriarchal politics. If you've ever been in a patriarchal institution, well, like the Vatican, envy plays a big role there. So I go through all the 7 chakras and the 7 capital sins that way. Every one of them really works. So what I'm trying to do is devise a new language for evil, to talk about evil, because evil is real and it's gathering steam. It's everywhere. Evil is smart. It goes where power is, and it's very drawn to places like the Supreme Court and other high places. And so we got to start talking about, because it's real. And
how do you define it?
Pardon me?
How do you define evil?
Yeah. Well, simply I would define it as the energy to destroy and to use power for power's sake or for ego's sake, as opposed to compassion, which is power with and passion with. And like I say, I think every news broadcast is giving us examples of evil. And there's a danger of giving it too much attention. You see, it wants attention. It wants more power, and that's how it gets more power. So we always you have to balance it, even thinking about it, with beauty. The opposite of evil is not good. Bad is the opposite of good. The opposite of evil is the sacred. And that's why, this whole discussion about original blessing is about the sacredness of the universe is so important today. That our 13.8 billion year journey is bigger than us. It's sacred. We didn't do it. We've received that gift, including the gift of the earth, over this time. And so I think it's real important to realize that the opposite of evil is the sacred. So the the struggle takes place in a world, not just of, what should I say, human laws and so forth, but of that deep place where we connect to what Eckhart calls a ground of our beings. And that's what's sacred.
And then is evil come as part of human nature, where that choice is there to either go toward the sacred or against the sacred, which is evil? Or why does it exist? And from where does it come from?
Well, why does it exist? I think it parallels the fact that we do have choices to make. That other species, like Thomas Merton said, every non-two-legged creature is a saint. So my dog lying here, he's a saint, most of the time anyway. But the point is that we humans have these added options and so many choices to make. And we're confused. And the native people talk this way too. They say that only the humans wander from the red road. Only the humans wander from the red road. And the bear is doing a great job being a bear, and the tree being a tree. But we humans have so many other options because we've got this imagination. We've got this consciousness that is so vast. And then we've got these problems that of course is what the psychological industry is trying to assist us with, the shadow and our what should I say, our temptations to greed and to arrogance and to racism and sexism and all that, which is all part of arrogance. So you look at human history and it's not always pretty. So, and we have to work at creating community. We have to work at creating peace and justice, but it's doable. That's what all the spiritual traditions are saying. They're all saying, hey, we're capable of compassion. And as Eckhart says, compassion means justice. It's not a sentimental thing about dropping crumbs from the table. It is about justice. It's creating structures that allow love to happen and to flourish. So I think we've been given this tremendous, we call it free will or freedom, but with it is responsibility. And, Aquinas said in the 13th century, one human being can do more evil than all the other species put together. Now, I'll never forget when I read that. I fell off my chair. Wow, something to be proud of. We were good at this thing called evil. And this was 800 years before Hitler or Pol Pot or Stalin. How did he know in the 13th century that one human being could do more evil? Because he recognized our power of creativity and how it can go both ways. It can do such wonderful things on the one hand for community and for music and all the rest. On the other, it can also make nuclear weapons and tear down a rainforest in a day that has taken nature and God 10,000 years to give birth to, and that will never happen again. So, we're in this great big, what can I say, drama of evil and sacred. And I had a dream several years ago that was very powerful, very simple and very clear. The dream said to me, there's nothing wrong with the human species except one thing. Today, nothing wrong with the human species today except one thing. Now that alone is shocking. I think we could pull out paper and come up with 99 things wrong with us today. But that's what it said. And it said, you have forgotten the sense of the sacred. That was the dream. And I think it's a big dream. It's a dream for the community. We have forgotten the sense of the sacred. And I think that's what the climate change is all about. We've been raping the earth for centuries and destroying the indigenous people who knew how to live closer to the earth. And now we're paying the price. And we better move real fast. I've been meditating a lot lately because they're finding all kinds of cousins of Homo sapiens, especially in Southeast Asia now. We knew about Neanderthal, we knew about the other denizens up in Siberia and all that, but now they're finding in Southeast Asia. There are 14 now that I've counted and they've given them names and everything. These are all our cousins. But the point is, they're all extinct. We're the last ones standing, Homo sapiens. And the odds are they were going to follow them because they didn't have what it took for survival either. So this is why spirituality and a discussion like we're having and like your program offers is so important. We've got to, as Thomas Berry says, reinvent the human. And we've got 8 years to do it. And but of course, one thing is that nothing moves the human like necessity, and so as the facts come out, if we allow them to play, and many politicians don't want them to come out, but as the facts come out, people are, getting engaged, and there's a lot of good stuff happening. Just today I read about how in India, they planted something like 60 million trees this year. Ordinary people, encouraged by the government. So I mean, there are many things we can do, and despair is a luxury. That if despair isn't going to accomplish anything, it never has. So we've got to, kick ass, and that's what the prophets have done, and that's what the prophetic vocation is about doing. We got to wake up, and that's why the Black Madonna's back, because she's about waking people up and shouting in the streets and talking about the suffering of Mother Earth, who's crying to get us to wake up. We're capable of it, but do we have the will?
Now, I was gonna. What?
We should probably wrap it up.
Yeah, I was going to wrap it up by asking Matthew for final advice for our viewers and listeners, but kick ass may be the final word on that. But what would you like to leave our audience with, Matthew?
Well, we all have to wake up. We all have to wake up and wake one another up, and then ask, what can we contribute? And we're not alone. There's so many around the world who are waking up, so many humans, but also, there are spirits, there are angels, there are our ancestors. The community of saints is the Christian term for that. But, and there are scientists, and all the religions have to wake up. Like I said earlier, we have to strip them down and travel lightly, but with the essence of what they have to give to transform us in deep ways. And I think we have to wake up to the joy of living and the amazement, the gratitude of being here after 13.8 billion years. And like this new telescope, the Webb telescope, I just think that's an amazing opportunity for our species. It's going to be, feeding us pictures of the original light of the universe and so forth. I mean, don't underestimate what we've already done. That humans are, we play a special role, and we are here to celebrate the universe. And so, I think that we've got to get more serious about joy. By serious, I mean, realize that, well, what Aquinas said, joy is a human's noblest act. We should lead with that. And joy is what we're trying to preserve and pass on to future generations, isn't it? And so, we have to start cultivating the best in ourselves and not waste time doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody, viewers, listeners, Matthew Fox has a huge library of his own writings. This slim volume collects a lot of the essence of his work right here. So we commend it highly. Thank you so much for not only being with us, but for all the wonderful work you've done over the decades, and may you continue for a long time.
And I really, I have many more questions. So a third visit, we will be requesting at some point. Much more to discuss.
Great. Well, thank you for our conversation, for this platform. I'm so glad that you have a platform.
It's our privilege.
It matters.
It does matter. Okay, thank you again.
That was Matthew Fox. Boy, he is an amazing background. He's written 35 books. He's been around. He's in his early 80s and has had an amazing career as a priest, and now as a priest in the Anglican Church, where, no, not the Anglican, the Episcopal Church. He started out as a Catholic, and, you know, to be asked to leave the Catholic Church because he believes people aren't born with sin is, you know,
I'm sure
something.
probably considers it a badge of honor.
Yeah, no, he's quite a guy, and you know, it was interesting. He studied in Paris. I had read that Thomas Merton was the one that recommended that he go there, and he really, I mean, he's a theologian. He's a practitioner. You know, he's obviously involved with people teaching, and he's thought through these things very deeply, and that he's taken scripture and applied it very clearly to what's going on in the world today with climate change and all. So he's a very, for a man that was born in I think 1940, he's very contemporary in terms of everything that's going on now.
High energy too.
Very high energy and very bright.
You think of how brave it must have been to take a stance so fundamentally different from
to be a priest in the Catholic Church and have
and then to take a stand
major and to stick with it. And he didn't get, and I'm sure there were a lot of other priests and nuns and clergy that believed in him and believed what was happening was wrong, but because their whole life is invested in it, were afraid to say anything. Because when you're tossed out from being a priest, where do you go? You're going to get a job at it's not like you're a professor and you get a job somewhere else. You're very tied to this organization.
Kind of like Republican politicians who talk privately about the condition of their party and Trump and won't say anything publicly.
Right. Yeah, I guess it happens all over, even in corporations. But
I'm sure.
And very articulate. I wonder. Well, we didn't discuss it with him. I'd be a question I'd like to ask him more about the Episcopal Church and how they are with him, and they probably are much less tied to dogma and really don't care what he says or thinks, as long as it's somewhat in line with their teaching.
They've always been more liberal.
Yeah. One thing that he brought out that was very interesting to me, I spoke to a fellow I know who is on the board of Greenpeace, and so a very active environmentalist. And I asked him once about the teaching, the biblical teaching, that may be a misinterpretation about how the earth is here to serve and animals are here to serve man, and just that teaching, how that has led some people to think, you know what, we can just absolutely destroy everything as long as it's in service to us, and how wrong that is. And Matthew Fox addressed that directly and gave his strong feelings about it.
And he's not the only one. Remember, we had Margaret Bullitt Jonas on. Right. She's also an Episcopal priest who is extremely active in the climate change and environmental movement. So there's obviously that kind of progressive element in the Episcopal, and it's also not as hierarchical. It's not a centralized authority as the Catholic Church. So there's latitude, and I'm sure, given that Matthew Fox lives in the Bay Area, the Episcopal, authorities there are probably very liberal. Right. So, but the other thing, I didn't realize about, I remember reading about creation spirituality a long time ago when it first became well known, and hearing about him. He's really beloved by so many people. Probably if a quarter or a third of the people who we've had on the show know him or know of him and hold him in high regard. And because I could tell by the endorsements of his books that a lot of them have been on our show.
Many others.
Mirabai, Starr, and others. And there's good reason for it. Like Thomas Keating, he is very ecumenical. Look, you saw him, in answer to one of our questions, he's talking about the chakras and, and talking about Thich Nhat Hanh. So he's obviously drawn from and learned from all the world's mystical traditions, just as Thomas Merton did. And, people like that. And so he's in very good company, and he's been a leader for decades in.
Yeah, no, I mean, growing up Catholic, I was exposed to different denominations of priests and nuns in different parts of the clergy and all. And then on the one hand, there are people like Thomas Keating, many of the Trappist monks, the mystics of the church that are open to other teachings and meditation and Buddhism and Hinduism and all. Then there are the more secular priests, there's certain orders of priests that are very closed down, and it's just our way or the highway, and nothing that comes from anywhere. But and I believe the Pope that he had the conflict with a couple of popes back was considered very, very conservative. The current Pope being considered more progressive, but maybe his hands are tied. He can't, because I think they should come back and invite him back to the church. Now he might say, I'm happy where I am. I have no interest in coming back, but they should apologize for what happened. It seems like, the worst they did. I mean, to really, really push him on that, it seemed, on the issue of original sin. And like he said, I'm not a theologian. I don't know. I can't confirm what he said, but I'm sure what he said is accurate. There's nothing in Scripture where it's in the New Testament anywhere it's anything.
Yeah. From what I know, original sin was invented later.
So it wasn't so original, was it?
Well, it was, I think, St. Augustine or something, as if I understand. But, it took the Catholic Church, it was only in recent years that they apologized to Galileo. So, it might be a while before they come around to that. You know what it made me think of? This business of moving from original sin to what he calls, creation spirituality or original blessing. And it reminds me of the difference between the Buddhist and Hindu, all the Indic religions, those traditions see the essential nature of the self as divine, right. And, of ananda, of bliss and infinite consciousness. And in the West, we have a different sense of what the core self is. And in some circles, in religion, it's depraved and sinful by its own nature, fallen from grace. And that I found in my research and interviewing people. Christians come of age and they say, that doesn't feel right. Why, right. And they struggle with it. Right. We're all depraved, we're all sinners and all that sort of thing. And if you think of, in the different sense of the word, like he said, the original meaning of the original term that was translated as sin had to do with being off the mark, missing right, the bullseye.
Right.
In that sense, we're all off the mark. Right, we're here to,
Right. And also the distinction between a sin of the flesh and a sin of the spirit. I never heard that before. It was fascinating. And also the differentiation between sin and between sin and evil, and I think I don't know if I mentioned this off the air to you, but I'll mention it again. Growing up Catholic, when they're teaching about right and wrong, you're 12 years old and they give you a list. These are the list of sins. These are the venial sins. They're bad, but not that bad. And these are the mortal sins. These are like really bad. And you see this list, and some of it is like ridiculous. I was impolite, or, it's like you don't get through any day without doing several of them. So then I think a lot of kids thought, you know what? I can't keep up with this. I'll just do what I want, So, but that making differentiation between sin and evil was very important when he talks about greed. And it's just, a very deep thinker, and he's really reflected on this. I mean, the guy's written 35 books, so he's really thought very deeply on it. Love to have him back on again. I'd like to have talk to him about thoughts on the afterlife and all of that, because that's also a big part of Catholicism and Christianity and how it relates to everything else he's been thinking.
You're going to hell, Dennis, for speaking out that way.
So it's like, it's yeah, anyway, so his thoughts on it would be very interesting. So another great one. Great job.
So that's the second time he's been on.
Oh,
and I think
say in our introduction, let's say it now. Please subscribe if you're listening.
Yes, subscribe.
It doesn't cost anything. Good. We'd like to.
And then you won't miss anything. You'll know.
Yes, we'll be there. We'll call you. I mean, we'll email you to let you know what's coming on. But we have some great ones coming up, and it is now February 2022, and so lots more headed your way. And
yeah, we've recorded a number of really great interviews that will be being posted, into April and May. Right. And those of you listening in 2023 or 2024, this is where it all started. But also, if you've contributed to help keep us on the air, we're not a nonprofit. It's not a donation, and we got a nice contribution from another podcast, right? So it's very, so people have been very good, and we want to keep the show free and open to the public, and as well. And please, you know what? We'd love to hear from you. Send us an email. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you think of the show. Tell us if you have any feedback for us or any
suggestions for guests.
Keep those cards and letters coming.
Rolling in. All right. Till next time.
Take care.